Hello everyone, hi! So today I'm taking on the impossible task of telling you everything that I had to read in my first year as a literature student. For context, I study comparative literature at the University of Vienna. I've just finished my first year and I document a lot of my journey here on this channel. In fact, I have an entire playlist that is simply called Studying Literature. You can check that out if you're interested. And one of the most common requests I get whenever I share a video about my courses or my studies is, can you please share your reading list? Can you please tell us exactly what it is that you have to read? So today I'm here to deliver exactly that. I took a total of 12 courses in this first year of mine, and I'm gonna cover 6 of them today. Sociology of the novel, world literature, an introductory course to general literature, an introductory course to comparative literature, time and memory in modern literature, and literary research 1 and 2. And next week I'm gonna cover the remaining 6 courses. So if you're getting something out of this video, I would appreciate it if you clicked the like button and considered subscribing. Even though just yesterday I have apparently hit 20,000 subscribers on this channel, I have to say I'm pretty blown away by that. In fact, hitting 20,000 has been my, I thought, way too lofty goal for 2024. So there's really nothing more I can ask for. But if you're enjoying this content, you're of course still allowed to subscribe. I'll also link my Ko-fi page in the description down below in case you're considering supporting the channel even further. I appreciate you so much for doing that. Thank you to everyone who has, bought me a coffee. So let me just give a general outline on how this video works, because a lot of thought has went into how I want to deliver that. And I'll have to throw some disclaimers in there in the beginning, because I think they're important. So the first thing I want to say is that the courses that I have chosen in my first year are the courses that I have chosen based on my interests. Someone else studying the same degree as me might have, based on their interests, picked completely different courses. For example, for my module on literary theory, I picked a course that was called The Spectres of Postmodern Writing. My friend Sophie, who studies with me, she picked a course that was called Feminist Literary Theory. Both those courses count towards our module of literary theory, but of course the contents of this course are very different. I think this is obvious, but I just felt like mentioning it because this list is by no means an exact list of everything that you'll have to read if you enroll for a literature degree. Even if you go to the same university as me, most of these courses are not offered again in another semester. So really, apart from the 2 introductory courses to literature and the literary research course, another person might have chosen a completely different set of things to focus on. Now, even though that is true, I still think this video is valuable in the sense that it is quite a fair representation of the kinds of texts that you do have to wrangle with when you decide to pursue literature on an academic level. And that's why I ultimately decided to make this video. The second item I want to clarify up front is that I'll go through the courses and I'll tell you about primary and secondary reading materials that I had to go through for each course. And I just quickly want to explain those terms in case you're not familiar. So a primary source of literature is usually a piece of fiction or a piece of literature that you want to talk about in a course. So for example, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, right? This is a piece of fiction. Secondary literature would be an essay on Mrs. Dalloway written by someone else. So in any of my courses, a professor would maybe say, please read the first 50 pages of Mrs. Dalloway, and then also read those 2 articles or essays by literature professors or other writers that try to illuminate this primary text that we're talking about. Right, so secondary texts are often scientific texts, research, opinions, usually not fiction. And yeah, that is the main difference between primary and secondary sources. Third disclaimer that I want to get out of the way is that I'm usually pretty diligent about looking up book titles in the original language. I really care about pronouncing the authors' names right. However, in this video, given the sheer amount of titles that are going to be mentioned, I'll not be able to do this. I've opted to look everything up in English, and the only exception I'll make is if a piece of research paper or a book is only available in German, then I'll just say it in German because there's no translation yet. So, if I'm making typos, I'm mispronouncing someone's name, or I'm getting things mixed up otherwise, just know that I'm not doing that to disrespect anyone. I'm trying my best, but in this video it's just a numbers game in the sense that it's very unlikely that I've gotten everything 100% correct. Another important piece of information is that you'll notice as I go through the video that I rarely have to read entire books. The approach during my studies has been much more to get an overview of many different pieces of works, dipping into them and drawing connections, and not so much close reading, just one book, mostly. There are exceptions to that, of course, but the tendency is that a professor will gravitate towards giving us a view into, say, 10 or 12 or 20 different kinds of novels over just focusing on one and deep reading that one. So as we go through the books, you'll often hear me say, we had to read parts of or 20 pages from this book. I'll try to be specific as much as I can, but just know that not all the books that are mentioned I have had to read entirely. And the last thing I want to say before we get started is that I want to caution you against taking this list and running with it. If you do decide to read everything that I mentioned in this video, you'll be very well read, and I don't want to discourage you from doing that, of course. But studying literature is more than that, right? It's more than just reading. And the real value for me this year has been having professors that are so passionate about a subject explain their point of view and explain things that they themselves have done research on. If you only take the books, then you'll be missing the glue that holds them all together. And by that, I mean the explaining and deepening that my professors have done, which in my opinion is the real value of studying literature. So, a lot of these texts have been used to support arguments and to support a discussion, and you're not getting the entire picture there if you simply focus on reading all these texts. Okay, I think that's all the disclaimers that I had to get out of the way. Someone once said in my comments that they love how meticulously I document everything. And I feel like this video is the epitome of that. So, in the name of meticulous documentation, in no particular order, let's get into it. In the first course, Sociology of the Novel, also called Social History of the Novel, we talked about 13 different novels and how they each represent a new era when it comes to novel writing. And often those novels also perfectly represent the time and mentality in which they were written in. So those 13 novels were François Rabelais' Gargantua et Pantagruel, Cervantes' Don Quixote, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Matthew Lewis's The Monk, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Franz Kafka's American novel, or Der Verschollene in German, as well as The Trial, or Der Prozess in German, Bertolt Brecht's Three-Penny Opera, or Drei-Groschen-Roman in German, Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, and Michel Houellebecq's Whatever. Now, to be clear, we didn't have to read all these novels entirely. Our professor presented us with this list in the first lesson, and he definitely strongly encouraged us to read them all. But he also said that there is no way that he could verify that we did. And I also feel like that would be besides the point of the lectures. It was a literary theory class where we just were taught to recognize patterns and trends in novel writing, as well as the societal changes that inspired them, not to reproduce the contents of each book. In that way, university is very different from school, I think. We often read through important parts of these novels together during the lectures, and our professor also provided us with bits of the texts that were important on the virtual learning platform. So these were the primary texts for the lectures. The secondary, supportive, more theory-based texts included Arnold Hauser's The Social History of Art. So in this one, for example, he copied 5 pages of that into our learning platform and we had to read it on our own. We also talked about Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology. There were mention of little passages by Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, as well as Gotthard Heidegger's Mythoscopia Romantica. We further looked at Johann Adam Berg's The Art of Reading Books, an essay by Milan Kundera that is called The Art of the Novel, and Friedrich von Blankenburg's Versuch über den Roman. I couldn't find a translation on that one. Also, a lot of works by Michael Bachtin were mentioned. We talked about his demand that great novels have to be polyphone, so poly meaning many and phone voice, so a great novel has to have many voices. And what he meant by that is that there should be opposing views on the same thing represented by different characters in a novel, and the reader should not feel like the writer is on one particular side. He said that Dostoevsky does that really well. His novels are like an orchestra or a choir in the sense that everyone plays a different part, but when they're playing all together, they're revealing this beautiful, multifaceted view on the same thing. Yeah, we also read a dissertation defense by Michael Bachtin, and I love how at the end of it he says, "You have the right to not understand me." And I thought that maybe I should make that the final sentence at the end of my videos. We further looked at Platon's Phaedros, Arno Shirokauer's essay Bedeutungswandel des Romans. Again, couldn't find an English translation there. We also talked a lot about money in this course, particularly when discussing Don Quixote. So we, of course, looked at Karl Marx's The Capital. And Karl Marx used a lot of literary references to support his ideas. Don Quixote is just one of them. There is an entire book called Marx and Worldliterature that goes into Marx's knowledge and usage of the classics to substantiate his ideas. And we looked at some quotes of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. More secondary reading for this course included Frederick Jameson's The Political Unconscious, Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act, Lucy Goldman's Sociology of the Novel, Hegel's Lectures on Aesthetics, Georges Lukács' The Theory of the Novel. This was arguably one of the most cited works throughout these lectures, so I think if you're interested in this topic in general, you're not going wrong with checking out this book. We looked at Walter Benjamin's essay on the concept of history, Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, as well as James Joyce's lecture on Daniel Defoe in 1912. James Joyce said that the true symbol of the British conquest is Robinson Crusoe, who, cast away on a desert island, in his pocket a knife and a pipe, becomes an architect, a carpenter, a knife grinder, an astronomer, a baker, a shipwright, a potter, a saddler, a farmer, a tailor, an umbrella maker, and a clergyman. He is the true prototype of the British colonist. As Friday, the trusty savage who arrives on an unlucky day, is the symbol of the subject races. The whole Anglo-Saxon spirit is in Crusoe. The manly independence, the unconscious cruelty, the persistence, the slow yet efficient intelligence, the practical, well-balanced religiousness, the calculating taciturnity. Whoever reads this simple, moving book in the light of subsequent history cannot help but fall under its prophetic spell. We further looked at parts of Ian Watts's The Rise of the Novel, Theodore W. Adorno's Notes on Kafka, The Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber, Novalis' Christianity or Europe, Friedrich Schiller's On Tragic Art, Sigmund Freuds The Uncanny, Dieter Wellershoff Vorübergehende Entwicklung zur Theorie des Kriminalromans, couldn't find a translation there, Delightful Murder, A Social History of the Crime Story by Ernest Mandel, and Siegfried Krakauer's The Detective Novel. Again, I want to emphasize that my professor just used some quotes of these books and essays to outline his arguments, to provide background, and to just substantiate his thinking with as many diverse thinkers as possible. We were not required to completely read any of these books or essays, so the engagement with these texts ranged anywhere from just a few paragraphs cited to reading a few pages. I think that's really amazing because like that we got a look into so many different sorts of texts, and you can just further your own research, your own studies if you have to for your degree or if you're simply interested in it. In this course we also talked a lot about Foucault, most specifically on the History of Sexuality Volume 1, The Will to Knowledge, as well as Discipline and Punish. In the Madame Bovary double lecture, we talked mostly about love, and some secondary reading for those were Jules de Gaultier's Le Bovarisme, la psychologie dans l'oeuvre de Flaubert, Barbara Winkin's Bovary Mania, Madame Bovary c'est nous. We also looked at letters by Flaubert and just analyzed a little bit how he desired to kind of live in an ivory tower away from society, and he wrote about that in a letter to Ivan Turgenev, for example. Other texts we looked at were Mario Vargas Llosa's The Perpetual Orgy, Flaubert and Madame Bovary, Charles Baudelaire's Madame Bovary par Gustave Flaubert, Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents, where he argues that we're never as vulnerable to suffering as when we are in love. And the last one is Eva Illus's Why Love Hurts, a Sociological Explanation. Some last sources to round this course off were Theodore W. Adorno's Negative Dialectics. I mean, Freud and Adorno in general were just all over this course. Then another text called Irrationalismus Moderne, Postmoderne by Hans Holz. Yes, that is a name. The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere by Jürgen Habermas. Literature and Evil by Georges Bataille, as well as his work Sovereignty. I mentioned that in my video about everything I learned in the first year of studying literature, because those ideas on Kafka and power and how literature should stay away from power, we have that We have those ideas from Georges Bataille. We further looked at different writings by Elias Canetti on Kafka, a text by Zizek called Die politische Suspension des Ethischen. I'm sorry, I'm sure there is an English translation for that. I would guess the political suspension of ethics. We looked at many different bits and bobs by Roland Barthes, as well as Walter Benjamin's Brecht's Drei-Groschen-Roman, on the popularity of the crime novel by Bertolt Brecht, and Michel Houellebecq's Public Enemies. So that was a whole hefty list. I promise the other courses aren't going to be quite as chunky. So let's move over to my course on the theories and history of world literature. This course tried to answer the question what world literature even is, whether writing world literature is even possible, or thinking of literature on a global scale is possible, how that can be researched and documented, where the term comes from, how different writers have tried to write world literature, and other questions like that. Canon studies were a little bit in there. And we looked at the West Eastern Divan by Goethe, his try to write world literature. I talked at length about it in my video titled Goethe on World Literature. We also talked about Ossian by James Macpherson, as well as Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. We talked about Ossian and The Sorrows of Young Werther in combination because Goethe used so much of Ossian in his book The Sorrows of Young Werther, and that kind of helped to make Ossian popular, and how that all led into the circulation of literature in different ways. Again, I'm gonna refer you to my Goethe videos. I talked at length about this in those. In terms of secondary supportive reading for this course, we first looked at two books, one by David Damrosch, What is World Literature, as well as Dieter Lamping's Die Idee der Weltliteratur. And they both named Goethe as being the first one to use the term world literature, which isn't entirely correct, but I'll read you a little quote by David Damrosch from his book. He is, by the way, the leader of the Harvard Institute for World Literature, I think, I hope I'm not saying that wrong. So he writes, "My claim is that world literature is not an infinite, ungraspable canon of works, but rather a mode of circulation and reading, a mode that is as applicable to individual works as to bodies of material, available for reading, established classics, and new discoveries alike. It is important from the outside to realize that just as there has never been a single set canon of world literature, so too no single way of reading can be appropriate for all texts, or even to any one text at all times." Some other works we looked at were Orientalism by Edward Said. We further looked at Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, again, Against World Literature by Emily Apter. Emily Apter also co-authored a book that is called Untranslatables, where she researches intranslatable pieces of literature. Very interesting. We also looked at the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, again. Some letters by Johann Gottfried Herder about his idea on Volksliteratur. Distant Reading by Franco Moretti, which is like a little bit of a reaction to close reading. Then we looked at Simone Vinco's essay Literary Canon as an Invisible Hand Phenomena. I'm not sure whether that is translated to English. It would be a shame if it's not, because this is a really helpful way to think about canons, I have found. So Simone Vinco argues that canons are made not by people who are trying to establish a canon, but that it's more of an invisible hand phenomena where many people who have a different goal, who are not even trying to make a canon, are making certain decisions that lead to a canon being made. I feel like that's very complicated. I'll try to explain it simpler. So, for example, a high school teacher may pick out certain works of literature that he or she finds important to read for teenagers in class. I might pick out books that I make videos about on this channel, and both of these acts, the high school teacher and me, we're not trying to make a canon, but just by us mentioning certain works over and over again, a canon sort of emerges. We also talked about Frauenliteratur by Nicole Seifert, Around the World in 80 Books by David Damrosch, Erste Sätze der Weltliteratur und was sie uns verraten bei Peter André Alt. We also just glanced at some anthologies and talked about how they're made and which texts make it into an anthology, etc. Two texts that were discussed quite a bit in these lectures were, first of all, The Rules of Art, Genesis and Structure of the Literary Field by Pierre Bourdieu, as well as Pascal Casanova's La République mondiale des lettres, or World Republic of Letters. So in the context of these books, we discussed the idea that the literary world can be seen as a sort of field with players on it, and most importantly that everyone who is participating in the game or in the field is following the same rules, and that also players who have a lot of capital already are usually bound to just become richer and richer, whereas newer, unestablished, smaller languages, for example, have to work a lot harder to gain any kind of recognition. So Casanova writes, "The temporal law of the world of letters may be stated thus. It is necessary to be old in order to have any chance to be modern or of decreting what is modern." Franco Moretti also touches on this point of the inequality of literature in his conjectures on world literature. We further talked about Maxim Gorky's mother when we talked about socialist world literature, and in the same lecture we also touched on Bruno Jasienski's Je brûle Paris, The Bowels of Liberty by Jorge Amado, Les bijoux indiscrets by Denis Diderot, De l'Allemagne by Germaine Destels, Palimpsest by Chorachenet, Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, Femi Osofisant's Tigoni, the African Antigone. I talked about that in my video on what I learned in the first year. It's that beautiful play where Antigone says that all literary figures are metaphors, right? We come in the color and shape of your imagination. And the last one in this category, Les Liaisons Dangereuses by Pierre Ambroise François Chauderlot de Laclos. We looked at this novel in our lecture on intermediality and all the ways in which this novel has been filmically adapted. In another lesson, we looked at the difficulties of writing literature for people who migrated into different cultures and languages. For that one, we read parts of Amodeus' Heimat heißt Babylon, Kafka für eine kleine Literatur by Deleuze and Guratti, as well as Questioning the Canon by Christine Meyer. Christine Meyer actually gave a guest lecture in this course, which was lovely. I think she teaches in France. I'm not sure at which university anymore, but she presented this book to us, Questioning the Canon. And we wrapped the whole course off by talking about a book by Elke Sturm-Trigonakis, which is called Global Playing in der Literatur, ein Versuch über die neue Weltliteratur. And yeah, that's how we ended the course. Listing all of these works feels kind of insane, so I really feel the need to emphasize once again We did not have to read any of these works entirely or anything. Sometimes it was as little as a quote or a concept that was taken from one of the essays, one of the books, and that was the extent to which we were required to, engage with these works. I'm putting it here because I want to be thorough, and because if you're interested in this topic, I just want to provide you with a list of resources. Okay, let's move on. So, next one. My introductory course to general literature was the first course I had to take. It was meant to be an overview, an introductory series of lectures, and we of course had to read Eagleton's Introduction to Literary Theory. We had to read about 20 pages of that one. We further talked about the 3 different genres in literature. When you talk about literature in German, I know it's a little bit different in every language, but in the German literary system, we usually differentiate between Drama, Lyrik und Prosa. So Drama is plays, Lyrik is poetry, and Prosa is prose. For the drama or plays lecture, we had to read Dea Loa's Manhattan Medea, which is a new interpretation of Euripides' Medea. For the lesson on lyric or poetry, we had to read some different poems by Heinrich Heine. I don't think we had to read anything as homework for prose, as far as I can remember. When we talked about canons and how canons are made, we read bits of Nicole Seifert's Frauenliteratur, I would say about 20 pages. Later we talked about Sławomir Mrożek's Snow White, which is a rewriting of the Snow White fairy tale. We talked about the characteristics of fairy tales and where the line, is crossed between something being a fairy tale and something not being a fairy tale. We also read an article by Albert Meyer that is called Literaturgeschichtsschreibung, and an article by Joab Leersens, Writing National Literary Histories in the 19th Century. On to my course on comparative literature. In the first lesson, our teacher told us that we have to read Don Quixote, and he said because the semester is very short, he can't ask us to read the entirety of it, but we had to read like the first 13 chapters or something. But he said, you really cannot study literature if you haven't read Don Quixote. So he warmly recommended us to go on with it. In case you're more interested in Don Quixote and you want to learn more about it, I have an entire video where I summed up everything that I learned in this course about Don Quixote here on my channel. I can link it in the cards again. Then we also had to read Daniela Dröscher's Zeige deine Klasse. I don't know, I didn't specifically like this book. I think my professor thought this was a good idea because it's about a woman. She talks about her upbringing and how she ended up studying literature and following her dreams. So, I don't know. Yeah, it was just not my favorite book by any stretch of the imagination. However, Catherine Cressman Taylor's Address Unknown has been just such a big discovery for me. I absolutely love this book. We didn't read it much for the content, although the content is amazing and I would strongly recommend you reading it. I've made all my friends read it, and yeah, it's an epistolary novel. It's letters that are sent back and forth between a Jewish man and his friend that is going back to Germany in the Nazi times, and yeah, you can just see how both of them are changing. Really packs a punch at the end as well. I love this book, and we discussed how peculiar it was to get this book published and circulated and things like that. Then we talked about Shara Genet's Palimpsest. We had to read the introduction. And this is another book that comes back in basically every course I took. It's a completely essential work of intertextuality, or more simply said, how works of literature influence each other and how they're built on one another. So if you study literature, you're not gonna get around this book, especially not if you study comparative literature. Then we didn't exactly have to read, but we talked about Granje Sertão Verdes by Juan Guimarães Rosa. I have an entire video as well about the complicated translation history of this book. I can link it up in the cards. Yeah, so we talked about this book on our lecture on translation, because my professor Stefan Kutzenberger has wrote a book about it. It's called Granje Sertão Verdes in Europa. So there you go. Then we read an article by Manfred Pfister called Konzepte der Intertextualität, as well as small excerpts of autobiographies, or rather, we read the beginning paragraphs of the autobiographies of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Augustinus, Goethe, Klaus Mann, Stefan Zweig, and the beginning of the autofictions by Annie Ernaux, Laurent Binet, Rachel Cusk, and Xavier Cercas. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. But in that lecture we discussed how, writing an autobiography and writing about your own life used to be something that is only reserved for old, white, accomplished men. For many decades and centuries, you were only allowed to write about your life if you were in some way accomplished. And recently that has changed a lot. You can see by the entire genre of autofiction, where you don't necessarily need to be 100% truthful anymore, how now as readers we seem to be very thirsty for insights into the ordinary, everyday, mundane life, and everyone's allowed to write about their own lives. On to my courses on literary research. This course was aimed at teaching new students of literature how to do research, how to quote, how to write, and there evidently wasn't a lot to read. There's this handbook, it's called Handbuch Wissenschaftliches Arbeiten in der Theater-, Film- und Medienwissenschaft by the University of Vienna. That is just handy to have if you want to write scientific papers. So I guess you could throw that in here. I did flip through that and used certain parts of it, but I'm not sure it really counts as having to read it. Further in this course, I had to transcribe a letter by Adolphus Usher to Anthony Panizzi. Panizzi was, I think, the leader of the British Museum Library, and he talked with Usher about the selling of the Teak Library. So I read and had to decipher and transcribe 2 of his letters. And then to practice our writing, we had to choose a topic that we want to research, and I chose Emily Dickinson's death poems. So evidently I read her poetry. I focused on 3 of her poems. Again, in the video on where I talk about what I learned in my first year, I went a little bit more in depth on that one. But I also had to read some of her letters and a lot of secondary literature that I'm just gonna put up on the screen now as a screenshot in case you want to look that up. I mostly focused on an article by Margaret Schnabel called Finished Knowing Then, the Deconstruction of Certainty in Dickinson's Death Poems. Okay, on to the last course. I feel like I have to acknowledge that my voice is super low today. I've been a little bit sick, so I'm still a bit low on energy. But it's definitely coming back now, because I've already mentioned that this was my favorite course to take this year. And yeah, Time and Memory in Modern Literature. What a phenomenal idea to make an entire series of lectures on that. This is great. So, some primary sources. First and foremost, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. This is amazing. Okay, what can I say about this? We had to read around 50 pages of this, because Thomas Mann does so much when it comes to time in this novel. It's absolutely breathtaking, beautifully done, so skillful. And yeah, our professor, uploaded us 50 or so pages onto our online learning platform. You can see here everywhere where there's a blue post-it, I had to read a few pages. And when I started reading his scans, I only got a few pages in, and then I just went straight to the bookshop and bought it myself because I was so taken by Thomas Mann's writing, and I still can't quite pinpoint it. This book was a big focus in this series of lectures. We also read about 40 or 50 pages of his Joseph and His Brothers. Then we read Hugo van Hofmannsthal's Terzien über die Vergänglichkeit, St. Augustine's Confessions. We focused on book 11, where he talks a lot about time. I'll read you a little quote so you can get a bit of a taste for it. Try as they may to savor the taste of eternity, their thoughts still twist and turn upon the ebb and flow of things in past and future time. But if only their minds could be seized and held steady, they would be still for a while, and for that short moment, they would glimpse the splendor of eternity, which is forever still. Yeah, then we also looked at a couple of works by Heimito von Doderer, specifically Die Wasserfälle von Slunj, or The Waterfalls of Slunj, Die Strudelhofstiege oder Melzer und die Tiefe der Jahre. I think in English it's The Strudelhof Steps, The Depth of the Years. And of course, a big chunk of time in these lectures went towards Virginia Woolf. We read her diary entries. I'll read you a few lines because it's just too beautiful to gloss over. Okay, so from Virginia Woolf's diary. Why do I trouble to be so particular with facts? I think it is my sense of the flight of time. So soon Towers Place will be no more, and twigs, and I that write. I feel time racing like a film at the cinema. I try to stop it. I prod it with my pen. I try to pin it down. And the novels we talked about of hers were Orlando, The Waves, The Years, To the Lighthouse, and Mrs. Dalloway. We further looked at Richard Wagner's Wesendonck-Lieder, William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, Sjećepan Twardoch's Drach, Wilhelm Heinrich Wackenruders Ein wunderbares morgenländisches Märchen von einem nackten Heiligen, Timaios bei Plato, Berge, Meere und Giganten by Alfred Döblin. I think that is translated to Mountains, Oceans, Giants. Erste Erde-Epos by Raoul Schrott. The Secret Miracle, or El Milagro Secreto by Borges. Really great short story that is about a man who gets killed, and just between the shot being fired and it hitting him, he gets time to finish his writing that he has been working on. So time gets way slowed down. It's great. I'll read you a little quote. It argues that the number of humankind's possible experiences is not infinite, and that a single repetition is sufficient to prove that time is a fallacy. Also by Borges, we read The Garden of Forking Paths, El Jardín de Senderos que se bifurcan. Okay, and then just a few more primary sources that we touched on. We talked about what they did with time. We didn't necessarily read big parts of it ourselves. But those were Michel Boutor's L'Emploi du Temps, John Galsworthy's Forsyte Saga, Anthony Powell, A Dance to the Music of Time, Günter Grasse's Der Butt, Uwe Jonsson's Die Jahrestage, I think that is translated to anniversaries, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, Vladimir Nabokov's Ada, as well as Pale Fire, This is another one we just somewhat glid over, but we looked at that beautiful passage where it says, "And here time forked." Beautiful. James Joyce's Ulysses. Proust, of course, the mandolin scene and many other little scenes where memory is displayed. And we had to read the end, which, of course, made me cry. And lastly, secondary sources for this course were mostly just texts that my professor has written himself. This is really his topic, and he just uploaded it to our learning platform. I'm pretty sure those are not translated to English, but anyways, here it goes. Achim Hölter, Amnesien auf den Zauberberg und anderswo, Überlegungen zu einer Poetik des narrativen Vergessens, as well as Die Tiefe der Jahre, which is about Doderers Strudelhofstiege and polychrony. And we also looked at some lexicas and literary lexicas and how time is defined there. And I think that is it. I cannot believe I did it. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions, let me know down below. Otherwise, I'll see you again very soon. Bye bye.